The last domain of the COBIT processes is called monitor, evaluate and assess. The second process is to monitor, evaluate and assess the system of internal control, and it has 8 practices. The second practice is to review the business process control effectiveness. The entities responsible include the Chief Financial Officer, the business process owners, and the audit function. The entity held accountable is the business executives. The practice receives 2 inputs, which are the compliance audit results and the reviews of operational use, both from the BAI5 process. It generates 1 output, which is the evidence of control effectiveness to be used internally. The activities involved in this practice include identifying and prioritizing risks affecting the business objectives. Key controls should be identified, and a strategy to validate the controls should be developed. The internal control environment should be verified that it is operating effectively, by collecting relevant information and developing procedures to validate this information. Evidence of the control effectiveness should be maintained. The third practice is to perform control self-assessments. The entities responsible include the business process owners, the Chief Risk Officer, and the audit function. The entity held accountable is the Chief Information Officer. The practice receives no inputs, but generates 3 outputs, which are the self-assessment plans to be used by all the management processes, the results of self-assessments to be used internally, and the results of reviews of self-assessments to be used by the EDM1 process and all the management processes. The activities involved in this practice include maintaining and identifying the evaluation criteria for conducting self-assessments. The results of the self-assessments should be communicated to the relevant stakeholders. The frequency of the self-assessments should be determined, and the responsibilities and accountabilities should be assigned. Independent reviews should be conducted to ensure the objectivity of the self-assessments. The results of the assessments should be compared against the industry standards, and the outcomes should be reported. Self-assessments should be controlled and coordinated with the internal and external auditors. The fourth practice is to identify and report control deficiencies. The entities responsible include the business process owners, the audit function, and several IT heads and managers. The entity held accountable is the Chief Information Officer. The practice receives several inputs that include the risk root causes from the MEA02 process, the root cause analysis, and the evidence of error remediation, both from the DSS6 process. It generates 2 outputs, which are the control deficiencies and the remedial actions, both to be used by all the management processes. The activities involved in this practice include identifying and reporting control exceptions, and assigning the responsibilities to resolve them. The enterprise risks should be considered when establishing the thresholds for escalation. Procedures for escalation of control exceptions should be communicated, and exceptions should be followed on. Remedial actions should be identified, implemented, and tracked. The fifth practice is to ensure that assurance providers are independent. The entities responsible are the business process owners, and the Chief Information Officer. The entity held accountable is the audit function. The practice receives no inputs, but generates 1 output, which is the results of the assurance provider evaluations to be used internally. The activities involved in this practice include establishing compliance with the codes of ethics and assurance standards. These standards include the codes of professional ethics, audit and assurance standards, and the international framework for assurance engagements. Independence and the qualification of the assurance providers should be established.